you. Thank you, and lovely to be here again. Thanks for having me, Kathy. Yes, I'm going to be really focusing on China today, but specifically about the British East India Company and what they were up to, mainly in the kind of 1800 period. But to do that, I'll have to go back a bit and give you a bit of background on what they were up to and how they were formed and what they did in India and so on, but we'll eventually get to what they were up to in China. But I'm specifically going to be talking about how they fought 2 wars to force China to keep buying their opium, who would have thought, and also about Robert Fortune, a Scottish botanist who was sent to China by the East India Company, basically for a bit of industrial espionage, to steal the secrets of tea growing and manufacture. So really we're talking about a story of a time that's been described as the rise of merchant kings, of a time when corporations ruled the world. It's a story of trade and trade wars, power of empire, and of industrial espionage. And it's a time when opium and tea were bound together in a way that I'll go on to talk about. I do want to say a couple of things first. Firstly, in case you think I'm singling out the British unfairly, I'm focusing on them, but this was a time when other European powers were also engaged in similar enterprises. We've got the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, various others, and it was a race, particularly initially for the Spice Islands, those islands around Indonesia, that had all of the exotic spices like cloves and nutmeg and everything else. It was in huge demand. And then later, we've got India. The French were there as well. A lot of people don't realise that. I mean, the British we absolutely associate with India and the Raj and so on. But the French had a whole area of their own around Pondicherry, which we don't tend to hear much about. And so, yeah, then it's the kind of rush to get into China. Huge market, big profits to be made. And so this is a story too about trade wars, skullduggery as well. Secondly, I want to acknowledge it's a very serious subject. Opium addiction was a big problem in China. The Opium Wars and the so-called unequal treaties afterwards are considered the start of what has been called China's century of humiliation, and which some historians argue still casts a shadow over China today and their behaviour. But I'm going to also have a bit of fun with it too, as some of it really, it's a little bit like a boy's own adventure, leaving you incredulously thinking they did what? And then they did what? And every time I think of this as a trade war, and of course Australia, we've had our own recent trade war with China over wine, lobster and so on, I've got to say into my mind pops that famous scene from Crocodile Dundee, if you remember that, where he's in New York and muggers try to rob him and they pull a knife on him. And he responds, if you remember, with a bigger knife, saying, "You think that's a knife? This is a knife." Well, thinking about our recent trade war, all I can say is, you think that's a trade war? This is a trade war. And now, of course, we've got Mr. Trump and tariffs, so I'm not sure that will be the image that pops into my mind now. But anyway, let's get started with a bit of background on the East India Company. How did they get started? What was their purpose? How did they come to effectively take over India? And what were they trying to do in China? So you can see the dates there. It started in 1600, which is surprisingly early, I think. But that was a time of a real kind of ships and exploration. Queen Elizabeth I, she was in the last years of her reign. Shakespeare was writing Hamlet at the time. I mean, that's, in our minds, kind of how far back it seems. But the East India Company was one of the very first joint stock companies. So it was a private company, had a board of directors and investors who could buy stocks in the company. So a little bit like companies on the stock market today. Think of it that way. They had a royal warrant from the Queen to operate, which allowed them to train in the East Indies. That's the islands around Indonesia there. They could make treaties, they could administer any territories they acquired, and they could wage war. Not a problem, the Queen said, off you go. Do all of this and, perfectly fine if you have to wage war with anyone to get the markets. And war they did. Initially they sent ships to the Spice Islands, but the Dutch were actually already there doing quite well. And so they eventually went to India in 1608. But they needed an army to do all this stuff, particularly if they were going to wage war. And this is their recruitment poster. So they're recruiting soldiers for the East India Company. You can see perhaps that it wants spirited young men of abilities, enterprise and steady conduct. Pensions were available. And it's significant, I think, that the recruitment poster shows the men in battle with native troops behind them. Soldiers are on horseback, thus subduing their opponents by force. And amazingly, at its height, the East India Company had an army of 260,000 men. It's phenomenal. And remember that this is a private company. So it'd be a bit like, BHP or something, goes to India having its own army, own navy, courts, coins, and that they were actually allowed to wage war. Not a problem. And then they acquired Singapore in 1819, Stamford Raffles, and that was a strategically important location primarily for trade, because if you think of it, it's kind of on a trade route between India and China, and quite a sort of central location for them. They were so successful in all of that they've been described as having an empire within an empire. But India became the most important base, obviously. You may have heard of Clive of India. I was walking down an aisle, spice aisle in Woolies the other day, and you can still buy, I don't know whether you remember the Clive of India curry powder, the sort of yellow and red, Clive of India, he's still there. He's an interesting man. I'm just going to digress a little bit about him because I think it gives the kind of flavour of the East India Company at the time in India. So he became the richest self-made man in Europe, and he made his money working for the East India Company in India. But to give you just a sense of the man, present-day historian William Dalrymple has reminded us and written, and he says, it was not the British government that began seizing great chunks of India, but a dangerously unregulated private company headquartered in one small office in London and managed in India by a violent, utterly ruthless and intermittently unstable corporate predator, Clive. So next time you're in Woolies and you see those little jars, you can say, I can see you, I know what you were up to. And again, just to give you a sense of the man, but also a sense of the East India Company and just how rich they became in India. In 1757, under Clive's leadership, they won the Battle of Plassey. It's quite a famous battle against the Nawab of Bengal. A Nawab is kind of a bit like a Maharaja, different but similar kind of idea. So he won the battle with his troops, obviously. And because of that, and the Nawab being defeated, the Nawab gave him land, which yielded £27,000 a year, which is a huge amount of money, funded by taxes, on the Indian people, the Indian poor, a lot of them. He also got £300,000 of plundered loot or gifts, £160,000 given personally to Clive, and large amounts of money to the Army, Navy, and the East India Company. And he became the governor of Bengal. But in 1772, he was back in England. He was a parliamentarian. And a parliamentary inquiry had been set up into the East India Company. And Clive was grilled by the committee about his purported corruption in India. And just to give you a kind of sense of how rich Clive was and the East India Company, this is how Clive justified himself to the inquiry. He got up before them and he said this: "Consider the situation in which the victory of Plassey placed me. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. The richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. I walked through vaults which were thrown open to me alone, piled on either hand with gold and jewels. Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." And you can go and visit one of his places now under the National Trust in Wales, which I have been to, and there's a big house, and then next to it there's almost like a big hall of a lot of his precious artefacts that he brought back from England. But I think what shocked me when I walked in, just as you go into the door of that kind of museum, there's a huge man trap, which I don't know whether you've ever seen pictures of them. They're a little bit like a huge rabbit trap, I guess, with you walk on that and it snaps together. Only this was for capturing men. And it kind of says everything in a way about Clive. But he was enormously successful, and he just sort of managed, to persuade them that he had been quite moderate, really, in the looting and everything else that he'd done. But anyway, let's move on to China. Whoops. Oh, and that's a photo of Clive, looking quite lordly, and I mentioned before that the East India Company produced their own coins. So that's a coin in India, 1 rupee, and the other photo is their headquarters in London. I don't think they had the whole building, might have, but originally they certainly didn't. Okay, China. Right, so what was on offer from China? Well, all of these exotic things for the English. So tea particularly, black tea, even though the Chinese tended to drink more green tea. But tea was in high demand in England. Silk and porcelain, beautiful, very thin porcelain cups that you could drink your exotic tea out of. So they were the big things that the East India Company wanted to buy and then make a big profit back in England. Tea was a big one, though. And between 1774, the value of tea had increased 100%. And by 1830, the duties on tea were over £3 million, or 1/10 of government income. Huge. I'm sure Mr. Trump would like that big tariff. But the big problem was that China wasn't actually very interested in English goods. They bought some woolens, some Indian cottons, and some exotic goods from like sandalwood and shark fins that had been collected in Southeast Asia. But on the whole, if you like, there are more things that the English wanted from China than China wanted from them. And so there was a substantial trade imbalance. And Chinese goods, when they did buy them, they had to be paid for in silver. The British had tried in the past to get a better deal, and they'd actually sent Lord Macartney to China in 1793 in an official sort of diplomatic journey with a letter from the king and hoping to meet the emperor and impress him and get some favourable trade terms, and also be allowed to set up a diplomatic mission in Beijing or Peking, as it was then. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because that's a funny, well, not funny, it's an interesting story as well. So Lord Macartney, he sets off from England along with his entourage, the letter from the king. He carries with them 600 crates and packages of gifts, hoping that the emperor would agree to them establishing an embassy in China. The gifts included textiles, scientific and mechanical instruments, including a planetarium and giant lenses, 2 carriages, field guns, muskets, swords, mortars, chandeliers, clocks, a diving bell, a hot air balloon, and the list goes on. It took them 10 months by sea to even sort of reach anywhere nearby. And then they were met by 37 junks, imperial junks from the emperor, who then took them up the coast to Peking. The only problem was when they got there, the emperor wasn't there. He had actually gone to his northern palace. So what to do? They had all of this huge amount of stuff. So they left their fragile scientific gifts, the planetarium and the lenses and everything. They left that at the palace in Peking, and they loaded everything up again and went up north. By the time they actually got to the emperor's northern palace, they'd been 12 months away from the start of their journey. So just a huge effort that they were really hoping was going to pay off. But they hit an immediate problem when they arrived, as the protocol was that all visitors had to kowtow to the emperor. Now, you've probably seen this in movies. This is where you kneel down on the ground, you put your head to the ground 9 times, and that's to show respect for the emperor. Macartney didn't want to do that. It's kind of like, no, this is too much, and what he said, look, I will do what I would do if I met the king in England, and I'm prepared to go down on one knee, but that's kind of it. I'm not going to kowtow. So this was quite a problem, and it took a few days to try to sort out how to resolve this issue, and eventually it was allegedly agreed that he could go down on one knee, and that's the kind of cartoon version that you see up there. There is some doubt about whether he did actually manage to go down on one knee, or whether he decided he wasn't going to win the argument and actually did the kowtow. But his version is that he was allowed to go down on one knee. So they did the exchange of gifts, but they weren't actually appreciated as much as the British had hoped, because China, remember, was hugely rich itself at this time, the emperor anyway. They were on the Silk Road, there was a lot of trade going on, he was hugely rich, and some of the gifts just weren't appropriate. Like the 2 carriages, for example, that they had struggled with to bring for 12 months from England. were not appreciated at all, because if you think about it, if you think of kind of pictures that you've seen of hansom cabs or whatever, with the driver sitting up the front, he's driving the horses, the driver is up high, the passengers are inside the carriage. That was never going to work, because nobody can sit higher up than the emperor. That would be absolutely unacceptable. So the carriages, unfortunately, were never going to work, even though they'd been, this huge effort to get them to China. Unfortunately, the whole exercise wasn't as successful as they'd hoped. They'd hoped to stay for about a month, or months even, but McCartney and group were sent off after about a week. And the emperor wrote back to say that he wasn't interested in trade because we possess all things, and that it wasn't possible to have a diplomatic embassy to be established in Peking. And so that long and very expensive trip was actually a failure. So they had tried to get into China before, but what they did have lots of in India was they had lots of opium. It was grown in India. It was regarded as a legitimate item of trade. You know, it wasn't something underhand. It was a perfectly reasonable thing to trade in from their point of view. And they had large warehouses of it, as you can see up there, administered by what they called opium clerks. So these were employees, English employees of the East India Company, and they were employed to manage an opium warehouse. Big business, as you can see. So the way they coped with it was that they refined the opium, they shaped it into balls, and they covered it with a protective wrapper of steamed poppy petals. And they would then be packed into chests, sent off to Calcutta, where they were sold at auction to private shipping companies, both British and American. In 1830, for example, 15,000 chests of opium were sold at auction. So they were making quite a bit of money from this. And China was a potentially huge market. The only problem was that it was actually illegal in China. And so they had to smuggle it in. Once these chests of opium were bought at auction, these private shipping companies would then anchor off the Chinese coast, effectively as kind of floating opium warehouses, if you like. And then Chinese smugglers would row the opium to shore, where it would be purchased with silver. So this made huge profits for the East India Company, and that silver could then be used for them to buy tea and the other desirable Chinese goods. So it was all kind of one big trade circle, if you like. For the Chinese, though, they weren't quite so keen on this, given that it was illegal. And, try again. And so they had a bit of a debate, a bit like here, like, what do you do about opium addiction? Do you try to lock up the users, or do you go after the suppliers, or do you just sort of let it go? And so there was quite a debate about what to do about opium addiction. But the other practical concern for them was that the trade in opium was greater than the tea trade. So in effect, if you like, you've got silver being drained out of the Chinese economy. So, you know, there's a trade imbalance, basically, more opium being illegally bought than the English were spending on tea. Eventually, 1839, Commissioner Lin, who you can see there, was appointed to end the importation of opium. So he set upon that, you know, with great enthusiasm, and he seized and burned large quantities of it. So a little bit, I guess, like the AFP does here when they get a big opium haul, they'll often burn it to get rid of it. He did that, And that, of course, outraged the East India Company. And they responded. Oh, sorry, let me just do this. They responded by sending troops from India, 5 barracks loads of ships of troops, 4 steam-powered gunboats, and 24 smaller boats. So, he burned our opium, we're going to go for them. It's huge, in effect, military exercise then, which became known as the First Opium War, which really ran from 39 to 42, basically because they wanted China to continue to take their opium. And that went on for a couple of years. They bombarded forts, they fought battles, they seized cities, they attempted negotiations. But the British were technologically far more advanced. They used their bases in India to provide troops and supplies, and their steam-driven vessels could go upriver and bombard towns. So they were much better able to fight a war on that scale. And by mid-1842, the Chinese realized that they couldn't win. And they signed a Treaty of Nanking in the middle of 1842. This had a number of really significant provisions in it, and you can see why it was eventually known as an unequal treaty. The British demanded, and they had to agree to cede Hong Kong. So this is when we get that start of the British being in Hong Kong for a 100-year lease. The Chinese also had to pay financial compensation for all of the trouble and expense they'd caused. They had to pay 20 million silver dollars, which was a huge amount of money, because they'd forced the East India Company to fight a war, and they'd lost markets, etc. They also had to agree to open what were called 5 new treaty ports. These were other ports in China that the British were allowed to trade in, and where British merchants and families could reside. The British living in those ports would be subject to British law, not Chinese law. So they couldn't be tried under Chinese law, they would be tried under British law. And Britain would have the most favoured nation clause, so that if any other rights by foreign countries were granted, they would automatically apply to the British as well. So imagine if this had been Tasmania, for example, and we've got, let's say, ships from a Mexican cartel sailing down here, smuggling their opium into Tasmania. We don't want it, we're worried about opium addiction. We try to stop it, and they start firing upon us, and we enter into some kind of military conflict. They win, and then, okay, we have to give up maybe, I don't know, Bribey Island or King Island or whatever to them. We've got to pay them a lot of money for all the trouble that we've caused. We've got to allow them to go into other ports, in the north of Tasmania, for example. And all of this, remember, is a private company that we're talking about. So that's why they're regarded basically as the unequal treaties, because China was so kind of beaten, if you like, by the First Opium War that they had to agree to some pretty humiliating terms. All right, now, then 1848, we've got Robert Fortune. He's the botanist. Who was engaged by the East India Company to find out how to grow tea and how to manufacture tea. And he'd already been in China collecting plants. So a lot of the plants in our gardens, may have initially come from Fortune's initial work. But tea was important because the East India Company didn't really know how to grow it properly, and they didn't really know how to process it. They thought that the tea that made black tea and green tea were actually two different plants, whereas what Fortune was able to show was, in fact, of course, the same plant. From Camellia sinensis, which means Chinese camellia. So if he could go in and find out how to grow it and how to manufacture it, that would be great. It would reduce their dependence on China, help the whole balance of trade kind of issue, and they could do all that in India. He was a perfect choice, Fortune, because he had that experience already of being in China, and he was a botanist. He was paid 500 plus pounds a year, which was 5 times his existing salary, so a huge amount of money, which today would be roughly 60 to 70,000 pounds. So a huge amount, plus bonuses, and he was allowed to have the commercial rights to any other plants he collected. So it was a win-win kind of all round, if he wasn't killed in the process. Because don't forget, the foreigners were still only allowed to operate in the treaty ports, and he needed, obviously, to go inland to the tea plantations. And he couldn't just roam freely in China. And if he was found, he could basically risk beheading. So that was an absolute no-no. They had to stay in the treaty ports and not just wander around China. So what did he do then? He shaved his head. He attached a false queue to the back of his head, that little plait, and he wore the clothes of a wealthy Chinese merchant, so he could kind of blend in. And he explained his limited kind of language skills and his strange accent as being because he came from a distant province beyond the wall. So he kind of got away with it. And he and his 2 Chinese servants he had, they travelled from Shanghai to the first tea-growing area by riverboat, sedan, chair, and on foot. It took them 3 months to get to the first tea-growing area. He then visited several growing areas and factories, and eventually he was ready to ship seeds and plants back. And he did it like this. That's a big Wardian case. Once closed, seedlings and plants could stay moist during the long trip. It's going to take some weeks to get them back to India. He sent 13,000 plants and 10,000 seeds back in the Wardian cases. Unfortunately, Zeller's official opened the cases, and that was a no-no because all of the plants were then ruined. So his first shipment didn't actually get there safely. The next shipment was successful because this time round he planted the seeds in soil in the cases. And so they actually then germinated and grew during the voyage. And he'd also recruited a team of Chinese farmers to go back to India and to help establish the new tea plantations. And so the tea industry boomed in China, in Darjeeling, Assam and so on. And we still drink, of course, Darjeeling tea and so on. But with that and the subsequent involvement of the Dutch and Americans, it actually ended up devastating China's tea industry because export demand fell because the British were producing it themselves in India. But Fortune didn't get beheaded, and overall I think you could say that he did a good job. One of his Wardian cases was discovered recently in England in a big estate, and they didn't quite realise what it was and had been being used as a rabbit hutch. It was probably very good. Okay, then we're on to the Second Opium War, so we're at it again. In 1856, which was 14 years after the first one ended. And it started in 1856 when Chinese authorities arrested the Chinese crew of a ship operated by the British. So one of these ships bringing opium in, and again, the Chinese authorities seized the ship, and that was regarded as an affront to their prestige and their control of the seas, if you like. The French actually joined the war with them, using the execution of a French missionary as an excuse, because missionaries couldn't roam freely in China either. In mid-1858, it looked like the war might end with another treaty, with Britain, France, Russia, and the US as parties, and that was designed to open up more ports, allow travel in the internal regions, diplomatic legations, and financial reparations again. But this time the emperor refused to sign, so the war continued. There were further battles, and they did capture some key cities, and they advanced on Peking. But in that whole process, the British consul and British and French officers were captured, and some were tortured and murdered. So, 1860, the British and the French retaliated, and they sacked the Summer Palace, which you might have heard about. It was quite famous. This was the emperor's summer palace. It wasn't just one building, it was like acres of buildings and beautiful gardens and so on. And they basically burnt it to the ground. And it burnt for 3 days and nights. And looting was actually accepted as kind of a legitimate payment to troops. It was kind of like the spoils of war. It keeps your troops happy if they can actually take some nice artifacts or expensive goods. And so myriad valuable artifacts were taken, including a small Pekingese dog, which of course the breed was beloved by the emperors but was unknown in England. One of these dogs was taken back to England, and it was presented to Queen Victoria. And she was very pleased, and had to think of a name for him. So if you're the Queen of England and you've been given a looted Pekingese dog, what would you call him? Well, she called him Looty. It's kind of like, you couldn't make this up, right? And so there's Looty reclining in splendour on his cushioned chair. And ultimately, there was a Treaty of Peking signed, which I think which again forced China to legalise the opium trade, cede further territory, including the Kowloon Peninsula, and pay reparations. So they had to pay up again. They had to open 11 more treaty ports and allow an increased amount of missionary access. And so thus, these two wars, if you like, just really began this idea of the century of humiliation for China. We've got the unequal treaties, huge amounts of money being paid, loss of land, loss of prestige, and painful humiliation, basically, that they were beaten, if you like, in both wars and really had to agree to some pretty terrible conditions from their point of view. Interestingly, and this is where we get on, if you like, to modern day, really, it's actually now considered as part, if you like, of the origin story of modern China. So the birth of modern China, and how do you think about that if you're Chinese? And so it's very much incorporated, if you like, into this idea that if you're backward, you'll take a beating. That's what happened. We had imperial China. It was backward. They certainly took a beating. And the idea that it was the Communist Party and Chairman Mao who rose up and saved China from the humiliating, defeated Chinese emperors, and they remade it. And many historians and commentators now believe that the worldview of the current Chinese president, President Xi, reflects this desire to regain China's position in the world. So it's, if you like, it's to make China great again. And hence, you know, its prestige as a powerful nation. So having recovered from this terrible, you know, humiliation in the 19th century, the Communist Party has remade China and will make it even bigger and better, and restore its prestige after this humiliating back down. Interesting enough, with the East India Company, it was eventually formally dissolved in 1874, but it's now back in business in a different form. In what could be described as the biggest colonial irony, it's back in business in London, this time as a luxury foodstuffs store. So selling, you know, luxury packaged tea and other luxury food goods. But what I think is particularly interesting is that its brand name is now owned by an Indian entrepreneur, Sanjay Mehta. And so this is the man who made the East India Company truly Indian. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Happy to go to questions?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Can I firstly ask?
Yes.
The role of the government in Britain at this time. I mean, this is East India Company doing all this. I mean, obviously they must have been complicit. They must have known what was going on. I mean, you mentioned an inquiry at some point. But
Yes, they certainly knew really what was going on. I mean, that the board of directors, you know, you've got all the good and the rich of England, if you like, wanting to be on the board of directors. So some of them would have been parliamentarians, maybe. There would have been people very keenly connected with the government. And I think at one stage I read that about 100 parliamentarians actually also worked for the East India Company. So there was a lot of enmeshment, I think, of that. But eventually, you know, it became, there were difficulties, there were massacres, there were a whole lot of problems eventually, and we had this parliamentary inquiry. But I think we can really say that there was a real enmeshment of the East India Company and the government, in effect, even though technically the East India Company was separate. Because they were making huge profits. So the shareholders got a lot of money out of it. So it kind of worked quite well for the well-connected
methods were similarly...
Yes, they were, and the French, they had their own equivalent, Portuguese. Yeah, it was a big thing. It suddenly seemed to kind of, with this whole rush to explore and get to the Spice Islands and whatever, you had a lot of the European nations really getting into it and setting up, in effect, joint stock companies of their own. And so then there was a lot of competition. When the English tried to get into the Spice Islands where the Dutch were, there was a little bit of conflict going on there because, the Dutch didn't want the English to sort of muscle in on their markets. So yes, there were a lot of them at it.
Is it true that the company soldiers were eventually incorporated into the British Army, and their army in India was the British Army in India rather than the company?
I think that's probably right. I don't know for sure. I haven't looked at that particular aspect, but I suspect that was absolutely right. Because once we get to the dissolution of the company, we kind of really move into the British government taking over India, and that's when we get the days of the Raj, and you have the British Army there. So I suspect you're absolutely right. Because they've got a lot of guys, what are they going to do with them? They're going to all go back to England. And they've got a lot of Indian troops as well, of course. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Wow, that was fascinating.
Oh, good. I'm pleased.
Hang on.
Cup of tea. That's right. As you drink your cup of tea, think of Robert Fortune.
That was really interesting.
Good.
Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your
You're
time
welcome.
again.
Yep.
And presenting to Year 3A.
Lovely.
So
Thank you.
I think anyone who says that they don't enjoy history and makes any sense out of history, I don't know what they're thinking. It's quite amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, thanks.